All right, so in this lesson, we're going to look at population genetics. And population genetics is a euphemism basically for how the gene pool of a population changes through natural selection. It can basically be said that natural selection works on phenotypes, right? Specific traits, right? That's what's being selected for or against, right? If you have the right traits, the right characteristics, and you survive well and reproduce well, then you are being selected for. If you don't have the right traits, then you are being selected against, and you're either removed from the population or you don't reproduce as well as those who do have the right traits. But remember that behind those phenotypes, those traits, is a genotype, right? Remember, natural selection is only working on heritable traits, okay? So these are traits that are encoded in the genes in our genotypes, right? So indirectly, natural selection is working on the genotype of the individuals in the population, right? It's actually selecting for or against specific genotypes, which means then if you look at all of the genes in the population or their gene pool, natural selection should change the frequencies or percents of each allele for each trait in the gene pool, and that's what we're talking about here. So the evolution of populations is fueled by this genetic variation. For individuals, you can look at the average heterozygosity, in other words, the average percent of genes for which an individual is heterozygous. But for populations, you can directly compare individual karyotypes or gene sequences to look at the alleles that are present in the population. Remember that genetic variation that fuels natural selection exists for two reasons. The first reason, of course, is sexual reproduction. We know all about that, right? You have meiosis occurring, which produces crossing over. Those crossover events produce variation. Independent assortment, the random way in which chromosomes line up and then get separated into different cells during meiosis. That's another source of genetic variation. And then random fertilization causes genetic variation. So the random egg that's released, the random sperm that fertilizes it, that is another source of genetic variation. So sexual reproduction has a bunch of genetic variation in it, but also mutation fuels genetic variation, right? Mutation is a source for novel traits to pop up often. And some of those novel traits are fantastic, some of them are not, but some of them also, what's important to note, are neutral. Okay, so that neutral mutation thing is kind of a big deal here, which means it's a mutation that produces a trait, but the trait isn't really good and it's not really bad, so it doesn't get selected against. It's not being removed from the population. It may persist for a while, but it's really just a neutral variation. So, for example, if you looked at human traits like baldness might be considered a neutral variation, right? It doesn't really impact your ability to survive. It doesn't really impact your ability to reproduce. So it's no big deal. It's a neutral variation that will persist in populations because it doesn't really hurt and it doesn't really help. Even though you may yourself not want to be bald, it doesn't hurt your survival or reproducibility. All right, so Hardy-Weinberg, this is what you guys have been working on. This is a test to determine whether or not a population is evolving. So the Hardy-Weinberg mathematical model is right here. This is it right there. Okay, it's an algebraic equation that says p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. Okay, if p is the frequency of the dominant allele, right, and q is the frequency of the recessive allele, then technically this equation is a support equation for it. The frequency of the dominant plus the frequency of the recessive should equal 1 or 100%. Okay. As far as Hardy-Weinberg is concerned, PQ then, if P represents the dominant allele, then P squared, sorry, not PQ, P squared is the frequency of a specific genotype, and that genotype is the homozygous dominant genotype. 2PQ has both P and Q in it, right? That's the frequency of individuals in the population that are heterozygous, and then Q squared is the frequency of the individuals in the population that are homozygous recessive. So this is the main Hardy-Weinberg equation, but it works as a system of equations with P plus Q equals 1. So this equation is all about allele frequencies. Okay, but this equation is all about genotype frequencies. Okay, see the difference there? So this is alleles in the population. This is the genotypes in the population. Okay, so in other words, if this equation or this equation's frequencies don't change over time, then the population is stable. It's not really evolving. If you start to see the numbers in any of these terms changing over time, or you see the frequency of certain alleles changing over time, then you know the population is evolving. So you can track using this Hardy-Weinberg equation whether or not you've got a population that's stable, in equilibrium, or evolving. All right. So again, this is just an example. At the start, this is the melanism in moths, right? At the beginning, you had two alleles, right? You had individuals, if they had the A2 allele, they were dark colored, the A1 allele was light colored, and the dark colored variation was dominant, right? So initially, your frequencies were 50%, 50%, right? You had half A1, half A2, but then when you apply selection pressure, right, you apply some factor that's causing natural selection to happen to this situation. In this case, it's predation. The ones that are expressing the recessive, the A1A1 trait, are remaining in the population. That's the advantage. The ones that have the A1A2 or the A2A2 variation are being selected against. And so what we see is that the frequency of that A1 allele actually goes up while the frequency of the A2 allele goes down. Okay, pretty simple when you put it in context like that. So again, there's a couple numeric examples of Hardy-Weinberg here. So this just kind of gives you a visual showing you the gene pool. This is all the alleles for the whole population, right? A1, that's P times P, which is P squared, right, or 0.49. The individuals who are A1, A2, right, are 0.3 times 0.7 or 0.21, right? But you multiply that by 2. So 2PQ is 0.42, and then Q squared is 0.09. Okay, so that's just a quick example where all of these little red balls and yellow balls represent an individual allele, and then that shows you how that translates into the P and Q part of the equation, but then also the P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. Okay, and again, here's just another quick example where you have the number of genotypes that are possible and the frequency of each genotype, right? And using that to get the frequency of the allele. All right, so for Hardy-Weinberg to exist, there are some conditions, some quid pro quos, some little things like that that have to occur in order for Hardy-Weinberg to exist. So Hardy-Weinberg is a mathematical model, and all mathematical models are only as good as their weakest assumptions, right? So mathematical models predict how things should go in nature. They try to explain how things go in nature, but sometimes assumptions are built into the model that may or may not always work. So for a population to be in what we call Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, right, meaning no natural selection is occurring, you have to have no mutation, right? There has to be no mutation. There has to be random mating, and if you ever watch the SciShow or the Crash Course Biology, Hank always says, he always tells his students never randomly mate. That's a bad idea, right? Random mating is a terrible idea. And in nature for organisms, random mating is also rare, right? Usually there's a reason why two individuals are mating, why they choose one another. So, again, the chances of no mutation and the chances of completely having random mating are pretty low, right? You have no natural selection. So all variations are considered equal and none of them are going to contribute to more predation or something like that. That doesn't happen, right? You have to have a large population for this to exist. So you have to have a statistically significant population. No gene flow, in other words, genes being moved from one population to another. So no immigration or emigration. So as you can see, rarely do all of these conditions exist. But actually what's interesting about Hardy-Weinberg is if you track over long periods of time the population, what you find is actually they do tend to stay in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so for the most part, populations are stable unless there is some selecting factor acting on them, right? One of these things isn't true, especially this natural selection one. All right, so to alter the gene frequency of a population, to cause the population to become in disequilibrium or to not be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, a couple things can happen. One is genetic drift, and genetic drift is a weird concept. It's caused by a small population size, right? Meaning if you had a population of 10 individuals and one dies, then you've just lost 10% of your population, right? As opposed to if you had 100 individuals and one person dies or one animal dies, then you've only lost 1% of your population. Same number of deaths, but in a small population, each one is significant, more statistically, is going to take up a larger percent of the population, right? So when you put it in terms like that, that makes sense why you'd need a large population. But there are also some random changes that can make predicting gene frequency difficult. So for example, you can have a small number of individuals that get isolated from the larger group and they have to reestablish a gene pool. So their gene pool starts out small. So for example, you have a flock of migrating birds. There's thousands of them. And maybe a small subset, say 20 to 50, gets blown off course and ends up someplace else, and they have to reestablish their gene pool. That's the founder effect. There's also something called a bottleneck. Like you have a population in an area and say a forest fire rips through and kills a whole bunch of them, right? So you've all of a sudden you've gone from this large population of deer, for example, to very few, right? Again, starting with thousands maybe or hundreds and down to 10 or 15. But in either case, what happens is for every individual that you lose all of their genes from the gene pool. So you start to lose genetic variation. And when you lose genetic variation, you start to see the persistence of recessive alleles that would otherwise not show up in the population very often. Those recessives start to become more prominent, and it alters the frequency of that population. And so small populations are under considerable stress due to that loss of genetic diversity. There's also gene flow, which I explained on the last slide, right? Most of the time, immigration and emigration are about equal, so this is negligible. But extensive immigration or extensive emigration in one direction or the other would obviously cause some serious changes to your gene pool. Okay, so again, if you're just looking at the frequency of alleles in a population of 4 versus a population of 400, what you can see is you get far more stability in that large population than the small population. Okay, and this is just looking at gene flow, how it reduces population diversity. Okay, when you have, this is gene flow where pollen is exchanged freely back and forth between the two populations, as opposed to where maybe something happens and a population gets blown way far away and you can't get gene flow between those two populations. All right, so if all of this stuff happens, if you start to select for certain alleles in a population, how come alleles don't disappear completely, right? If natural selection is favoring a particular trait and that trait is associated with a particular allele, how come the other allele still persists? And there's a couple reasons. First of all, there is diploidy. You have 2 copies of every single one of your alleles, right? So if a preferred trait is dominant, the recessive is still going to persist, even though that's not the preferred trait in the population. It's the trait that would be selected against. But you can be heterozygous for your dominant allele, which means you have the preferred trait, but you're still carrying that recessive, not preferred trait around with you. So heterozygotes are always going to preserve that genetic diversity. And then there's something called balancing selection. When a natural selection maintains two forms of a trait for different reasons. One example is the heterozygote advantage. So with sickle cell disease, which causes pain and discomfort and hospitalizations and can actually kill a person, you would think that would disappear quickly from populations, right? But in tropical areas, it turns out that people who are carriers for sickle cell disease actually are resistant to the symptoms of malaria. They don't get as sick. They do get sick, so they're not immune. Don't ever tell College Board that somebody's immune to sickle or to malaria. But individuals who are heterozygous for that gene actually are resistant to the symptoms. They don't get as sick and they survive better, which means actually heterozygotes are favored in the tropics for that particular disorder. Frequency-dependent selection, as a phenotype becomes more common, it loses its advantage. So, for example, the example that comes to mind in my head is a predation example. The startle reflex. I don't know if you realize, but you startle in the direction of your dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, when somebody jumps out and scares you, you startle a little bit to the right, which I'm backward from my camera is showing me backward. But if you are left-handed, you would startle in the other direction. Scientists hypothesize that left and right-handedness and the direction in which you startle is important because in our ancestral environment, if a predator jumped out at you and surprised you, that startling to one side or the other gives you that split second where you're just slightly out of the way of the predator, and that gives you the advantage to run off and evade predation. But if all animals in the population start to the right side, then the predator is always going to, when they attack, correct for that and move to the right-hand side. But if a certain percentage actually startles in the opposite direction, then it gives them a little bit more of an advantage because the predator has, if the predator is always predicting that they're going to startle to the right, they're going to have more chances of catching individuals that startle to the right, but those that startle to the left would catch the predator off guard. But if over time more and more individuals start startling to the left, the predator is going to pick up on it as that becomes more and more common, and you're gonna see the predator correcting for that, right? The predatory population. So you can't have too many of one or the other, and so natural selection favors both. And then there are the neutral variations, right? Mentioned that a mutation has little or no effect either on the phenotype or the reproductive success. And so those variations, natural selection only gets rid of things that are disadvantageous, right? Those are the things that get selected against. If a mutation is neutral, natural selection doesn't really have a mechanism for removing it. So those genetic variations would persist. Why is there no perfect? Because remember, natural selection only acts on existing variations, right? And all the intermediate steps to get to that variation, that perfect, have to be an advantage, right? So for example, one of my old college professors said, it'd be really great if all of us had wheels instead of feet, right? Wheels would make us be able to get around faster. Our ancestors, if they had had wheels, would have been able to evade predation better, maybe even be better hunters because they'd be able to catch more and things like that. The problem is the structural changes to the bones in the feet that it would take in the intermediate steps from flat-footedness to wheels for the feet. All of those individual steps would have been so disadvantageous that we never would have gotten there. So you never would see wheels on somebody's feet or instead of feet, because all those intermediate steps would have been selected against, and so you'd never go in that direction. Again, also that means you can't scrap ancestral anatomy to build something new. I mentioned the knee early on being a problem, right? Most people get knee injuries at some point in their life. That's because the knee was a quadrupedal adaptation. It was designed to bear weight differently than how our bodies actually bear weight. That weight was supposed to be spread evenly over 4 feet, not over 2. And because the knee structure didn't really change as our ancestors evolved to be upright, the knee didn't really pan out very well in natural selection. And again, that's why there's no such thing as a perfect knee. Adaptations are also often compromises. So if you if you have, say, seals that use their flippers for getting around on land, but also swimming, they're not so great on land, right? They can get around on land, but their primary function is to swim in the water and to evade predation in the water. So they've kind of sacrificed that motility on land for being able to be maneuverable in the water because there's a greater threat in the water. At least there was for an ancestor. On land, though, they're particularly vulnerable. And then chance, natural selection, and the environment have to interact. So you have to get the right mutation that evolves at the right moment, or that occurs at the right moment to cause a specific adaptation for the right environment, right? So all of those things mean you don't really get perfection. And perfection isn't always great anyway. There is such a thing as too well adapted. Remember, environments are moving targets, right? So if you have an organism that adapts perfectly to the environment, and then the environment changes, all of a sudden they're not adapted anymore. So sometimes being a generalist is actually an advantage. So if you look at crocodilians, for example, they've changed relatively little since they evolved in the time of dinosaurs, right? And they're sort of nondescript sort of function, because it hasn't changed and they haven't overly adapted, they can get by in pretty much any environment that they find themselves in, which is why they've been so successful. They survived after dinosaurs became extinct, and they continue to survive.